The winter of 1944 brought more than snow to the frozen fields of Europe. It brought a problem that no amount of courage could solve. American infantry, armed with the M1A1 bazooka, found themselves facing German armor they simply could not penetrate. The mathematics were brutal and unforgiving. A Panther's frontal armor measured 80 millimeters thick, sloped at angles that made it effectively twice that. The bazooka-shaped charge could punch through 76 millimeters under perfect conditions. Perfect conditions didn't exist in war. The weapon itself represented American ingenuity at its finest. Officially designated the M1A1 rocket launcher, it fired a 236-inch diameter rocket propelled by a solid fuel motor. The warhead contained a shaped charge, a hollow cone of explosive lined with copper that, when detonated, transformed into a superheated jet of metal capable of burning through steel. But there was a catch. The charge needed distance to form properly, to close, and the jet never fully developed. Too far, and it dissipated before impact. The sweet spot existed in a narrow window, roughly 6 to 8 inches from the target surface. Combat didn't care about sweet spots. When a soldier fired at a moving tank, adrenaline flooding his system, hands shaking from cold and fear, the rocket wobbled. It yawed. It pitched. By the time it reached the target, the nose cone might strike at any angle. The warhead detonating too close or too far, or at a cant that scattered the jet uselessly across hardened steel. The official penetration figures assumed optimal conditions. War provided none. The problem wasn't just academic. In the forests of the Ardennes, in the rubble of French villages, in the frozen mud of the Siegfried Line, American infantry watched their bazooka rounds spark off German armor like firecrackers. They fired, and the tanks kept coming. They fired again, aiming for tracks, for vision ports, for any weakness they could find, and still the tanks advanced. Men died because geometry failed them. If you have your own story about infantry, anti-tank weapons, or if your family has connections to this history, share it in the comments below. These personal accounts keep history alive. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next deep dive into untold chapters of history. The American military establishment understood the problem. Engineers at Aberdeen Proving Ground ran test after test, documenting failure modes, calculating optimal standoff distances, proposing solutions that required retooling factories and redesigning munitions. All of it took time. Time measured in months, maybe years. Time the infantry didn't have. So the infantry did what infantry has always done. They adapted. Somewhere in the winter chaos of late 1944, a soldier whose name history didn't bother to record had an idea so simple it seemed absurd. He took a wooden stick, probably scavenged from the rubble, and lashed it to the nose of his bazooka rocket with string. Just string, the kind you might use to tie a package. When he fired, the stick hit first, holding the warhead at the exact distance it needed to form the killing jet. The rocket that had been sparking off armor suddenly burned through it. Word spread the way solutions spread in combat. Soldier to soldier, squad to squad, company to company. Not through official channels or techno bulletins, but through the desperate communication network of men who needed to kill tanks before the tanks killed them. They used sticks at first, then wire, then whatever they could find. The modification took minutes. It costs nothing. It worked. But string and sticks weren't standardized. They broke. They fell off. They varied in length, and variation meant uncertainty, and uncertainty in combat meant death. What the soldiers needed was something consistent, something that could be replicated exactly, something that would survive the rough handling of men fighting in mud and snow and urban rubble. They needed it to be exactly the right length, every single time. The solution came from the most American of sources. Currency, a dollar bill, the ordinary paper money every soldier carried measured exactly 14 inches long. Someone discovered, either through calculation or a lucky accident, that this length provided nearly optimal standoff for the M1A1's shape-charged warhead. Take a dollar bill, fold it lengthwise, tape or tie it to the nose cone. Fire. The warhead detonates at the perfect distance. The jet forms fully. Steel that had been impenetrable becomes vulnerable. The modification spread like wildfire through the winter campaigns. Soldiers called it different things in different units. The dollar trick, the money shot, the standoff rig. Some units issued informal guidance. Take your rocket, take $1. making it work. Others left it to the natural communication network of combat veterans, teaching replacements how to stay alive. By January 1945, it was common enough that officers stopped pretending they didn't know about it. If you've heard stories about improvised modifications in combat, or if your relatives served in the infantry during the winter of 1944-45, share what you know in the comments. These details matter. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more untold stories from the war. The technical explanation for why it worked reveals the elegant brutality of shaped charge physics. When high explosive detonates against a metal surface, it simply fragments the metal through shock and pressure, devastating against soft targets, barely scratching heavy armor. But a shaped charge doesn't rely on simple explosive force. The hollow cone focuses the detonation, transforming the copper liner into a jet of molten metal traveling at speeds exceeding 25,000 feet per second. At those velocities, steel behaves like a fluid. The jet doesn't cut. It doesn't melt in the conventional sense. It flows through the armor, creating a narrow channel of superheated metal and gas. But this jet needs time and space to form. The detonation creates a pressure wave that collapses the copper cone from apex to base, rolling it into the characteristic jet shape. This collapse takes microseconds, but at the scales involved, microseconds matter. If the warhead detonates on contact, the jet hasn't fully formed when it strikes. The penetration depth drops dramatically. If it detonates too far away, the jet disperses, losing coherence and energy. The optimal standoff distance represents the moment when the jet is fully formed but hasn't yet begun to lose definition. For the M1A1's 36-inch warhead, that distance fell between 6 and 8 inches. A dollar bill provided 6.14 inches. Close enough. More importantly, it provided consistency. Every dollar bill was the same length, minted to exact specifications, durable enough to survive being taped to a rocket, available in every soldier's pocket. It was the perfect battlefield expedient, accidentally optimized by the US Treasury Department decades before anyone thought to strap it to a shaped charge. The impact on combat effectiveness was immediate and measurable, though not in ways that made it into official after-action reports. Soldiers started engaging armor with renewed confidence. Ambush positions became viable again. The psychological weight of facing tanks shifted slightly back toward center. German armor could still kill, still dominated most engagements, but it was no longer invulnerable to the infantry's primary anti-tank weapon. German tankers noticed. After-action interviews with captured crews revealed that they'd observed a change in American bazooka effectiveness during the winter campaigns. Hits that would have deflected earlier in the war now penetrated. They couldn't identify what had changed, only that some speculated about new ammunition. Others thought the Americans had received upgraded launchers. None suspected that the difference was 6 inches of paper currency and some adhesive tape. The modification worked best at close range, under 100 yards where accuracy remained high and the rockets relatively slow, velocity less of a factor. At longer ranges, the standoff rig became a liability. The sticker dollar bill caught wind, destabilized the rocket's flight, made it even less accurate than it already was. Smart soldiers learned to judge the engagement distance, applying the modification for close ambushes, removing it for longer shots. If your family has stories about close quarters armor engagements, or if you've found information about field modifications in unit histories, share them below. These details help complete the picture. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into military history. Not every unit adopted the practice uniformly. Some commanders, concerned about the unofficial nature of the modification, discouraged it. Others tacitly approved while avoiding putting anything in writing that might expose them to criticism if something went wrong. A few officers actively promoted it, scrounging extra dollars from unit funds to ensure their men had the materials they needed. The informal nature of the adoption meant that effectiveness varied by unit, by commander, by individual soldier initiative. The official military response came slowly, filtered through layers of bureaucracy that moved at a pace divorced from battlefield reality. Field reports documented increased penetration. Technical intelligence officers noted the phenomena. Engineering boards analyzed the principle. By the time official recommendations worked their way through the system, the war in Europe was entering its final months. The next generation bazooka, the M9A1 with its two 75-inch diameter rocket, incorporated lessons learned from the field modifications. It featured a redesigned warhead with an extended nose cone that provided built-in standoff. No dollar bills required. The weapon arrived in theater during the spring of 1945. Too late for the winter campaigns, but in time for the final pushes into Germany. Soldiers who'd fought with the modified M1A1 appreciated the improvement. They also knew where the design had come from. Not from Aberdeen Proving Ground or from academic study, but from some unknown soldier who'd folded a dollar bill and changed the geometry of combat. The story reveals something fundamental about how war actually functions. Beyond the official histories and sanitized accounts, innovation doesn't always flow downward from laboratories and design bureaus. Sometimes it flows upward from necessity, from soldiers who face problems that can't wait for official solutions, from the kind of practical ingenuity that emerges when survival depends on it. The shape charge principle itself traced back 2 decades of research, from the Monroe effect discovered in the 1880s to the systematic development of anti-tank weapons in the 1930s. The mathematics were well understood, the physics were documented, but understanding why something should work doesn't automatically translate to making it work under combat conditions. The gap between theory and practice gets filled by soldiers who modify, adapt, and improvise. Other armies faced similar problems with similar weapons. The British Piat, the German Panzerfaust, the Soviet RPG-43 all relied on shape charge warheads, all struggled with standoff distance optimization. Some incorporate a fixed standoff probes in their designs. Others relied on nose cone geometry to ensure a proper detonation distance. The Americans had simply fielded a weapon that lacked these refinements, then gave it to soldiers creative enough to develop their own. If you know of other field modifications that changed how weapons performed, or if your research has uncovered similar stories, share them in the comments. This kind of tactical innovation is often lost to history. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more untold chapters of the war. The human cost of the original design flaw is harder to quantify. How many men died firing bazookas that sparked harmlessly off armor? How many ambushes failed because the weapons didn't work as expected? How many soldiers lost confidence in their equipment, hesitated at critical moments, died because they doubted whether their rockets would penetrate? The numbers don't exist. They can't exist. But the impact was real, measured in lives rather than statistics. The soldiers who developed and spread the dollar bill modification didn't receive medals. Their names didn't appear in technical bulletins or weapons development histories. They were simply infantry doing what infantry does, solving the immediate problem in front of them with whatever materials came to hand. The modification saved lives. It killed tanks. It worked. That was enough. By the spring of 1945, as American forces pushed deeper into Germany, the tactical situation shifted. Close-range infantry engagements with armor became less common. The collapse of German logistics meant fewer operational tanks. Air superiority and artillery dominance reduced the burden on infantry anti-tank weapons. The dollar bill modification, born of desperate necessity in the winter campaigns, gradually faded from use as the weapons it was designed for were replaced and the tactical environment evolved. But for those months in late 1944 and early 1945, for the soldiers freezing in foxholes watching German armor approach, for the men who'd fired and watched their rockets bounce off, for the infantry who suddenly found they could kill the tanks that had been killing them, 6 inches of paper currency meant everything. It meant the difference between helplessness and agency, between being victims and being soldiers who could fight back. The technical principle behind the modification found its way into post-war weapons development. Modern anti-tank rockets universally incorporate standoff probes or nose cone designs that ensure optimal detonation distance. The RPG-7, the M72 LAW, the AT-4, all learned the lesson that an unknown American soldier taught with a dollar bill and some string. The principle is now so standard that weapons designers take it for granted, rarely acknowledging the battlefield origins of the requirement. Military museums sometimes display M1A1 bazookas with the dollar bill modification, artifacts of improvised warfare preserved in glass cases. The explanatory placards describe the technical principle, the improved penetration, the eventual incorporation into official designs. They rarely mention the desperation that drove the innovation, the cold calculation that 6 inches of paper might be the difference between life and death. If your family kept artifacts from the war, or if you've seen examples of field modifications in museums or collections, share what you've found. These physical connections to history matter. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more stories from the front lines. The story of the dollar bill modification exists in an interesting space in military history. Too small for official recognition, too significant for complete obscurity. It appears in veteran memoirs as a detail, in unit histories as a footnote, in technical analysis as an example of battlefield improvisation. But it rarely gets examined for what it really represents, a fundamental truth about how war actually works versus how we imagine it works. We like to think of warfare as a contest between technological systems, between the products of laboratories and factories, between the official products of military-industrial development. And it is those things, but it's also a contest between soldiers and the immediate problems they face, between textbook solutions and battlefield reality, between what weapons are supposed to do and what they actually do under stress. The M1A1 bazooka was supposed to penetrate German armor. On paper, according to test results, it could punch through 76 millimeters of steel. In practice, under combat conditions, it often couldn't. The gap between supposed to and could wasn't a design flaw exactly. It was a reality gap. The difference between controlled testing and chaotic implementation. Closing that gap required someone to notice the problem, understand why it existed, and develop a solution using available materials. It required someone to test that solution, verify it worked, and share it with others. It required an informal network of communication that could spread practical knowledge faster than official channels. It required hundreds or thousands of soldiers to adopt and adapt the technique to their own circumstances. All of this happened without official approval, without technical bulletins, without the blessing of higher command. It happened because soldiers needed it to happen, and because the alternative was dying while firing weapons that didn't work. That kind of pressure creates innovation faster than any development program. The winter of 1944-45 produced numerous similar modifications. Tankers welded extra armor onto their shirts, creating the improvised armor that factory modifications would later incorporate. Machine gunners modified feed mechanisms to reduce jamming. Radio operators jury-rigged antennas to improve range. Artillery crews developed firing techniques, not covered in any manual. The military as a whole was engaged in a massive, distributed problem-solving exercise, finding solutions that doctrine hadn't anticipated and regulations didn't cover. Some of these modifications received official recognition eventually. Others remained in the realm of veteran knowledge, passed down through stories and memoirs. The dollar bill trick falls somewhere in the middle, known enough to be documented, informal enough to remain outside official history, significant enough to be remembered. If you've researched other examples of battlefield innovation, or if your family's military service included this kind of improvisation, share it below. These stories deserve preservation. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more deep dives into the real history of warfare. The German perspective on American anti-tank capabilities shifted during the winter campaigns, though they never quite understood why. Intelligence assessments noted improved bazooka effectiveness but attributed it to new ammunition or updated launchers. The idea that the change came from paper currency and adhesive tape was too simple, too improvised, too far outside the paradigm of systematic weapons development to be seriously considered. This failure of imagination worked in the Americans' favor. German countermeasures focused on armor improvements and tactical adjustments to counter perceived new weapon systems. They added standoff armor to some vehicles, increased spacing between operational tanks, modified approach tactics, all appropriate responses to improved anti-tank weapons. None of them addressed the actual change, which was simply making existing weapons work the way they were always supposed to work. The psychological impact on American infantry was perhaps as significant as the tactical improvement. Soldiers who'd lost confidence in their bazookas, who'd watched rockets fail against armor, who'd felt helpless against German tanks, suddenly had agency again. The weapon worked. They could fight. That shift in confidence affected everything from tactical decisions to individual morale to unit cohesion. Combat effectiveness isn't purely technical. It's partly psychological, partly about belief in your equipment and your ability to affect the outcome. A weapon that works half the time creates very different psychological effects than a weapon that works consistently. The dollar bill modification didn't make the bazooka perfect, but it made it reliable enough that soldiers trusted it again. The economic irony of using currency as ammunition components wasn't lost on the soldiers who employed the technique. They joked about the literal cost of killing tanks, about spending money on Germans, about the best investment a dollar could buy. Gallows humor in the face of mechanized death, but also recognition that they'd found something that worked. something worth the trivial cost of paper currency compared to the value of lives preserved. Some soldiers kept their modified rockets as souvenirs. Dollar bills still attach artifacts of ingenuity under pressure. Others discarded them as soon as better weapons arrived. Practical men with no sentimentality for tools once they'd been the ones who kept them, who brought them home, who preserved them in attics and footlockers, understood that the modification represented something more than tactical. It represented survival through adaptation, the official adoption of standoff mechanisms in the M9A1. Bazooka validated the field modification without explicitly acknowledging it. Engineers at Aberdeen could claim they'd arrived at the solution through analysis and testing, which was technically true. But the soldiers who'd folded dollar bills 6 months earlier knew where the real innovation had originated. They knew the difference between laboratory discovery and battlefield necessity. If your research has uncovered official documentation of this modification, or if you have access to period photographs or veteran accounts, share them in the comments. Primary sources matter for understanding what actually happened. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next exploration of military history. Post-war analysis of anti-tank weapons consistently identified standoff distance as a critical variable in shape charge effectiveness. Technical manuals included detailed discussions of optimal detonation distances, of the physics governing jet formation, of design features that ensured proper standoff. None of this analysis was new. The physics were well established. What was new was the recognition that combat conditions required foolproof implementation, that weapons had to work correctly even when handled by exhausted soldiers under fire in terrible weather. The lesson influenced an entire generation of weapons design. Modern anti-tank rockets are essentially idiot-proof, designed so the proper standoff happens automatically regardless of how the weapon is fired or how the rocket strikes. The soldier doesn't need to modify anything, doesn't need to understand the physics, doesn't need to do anything except aim and fire. The weapon takes care of the rest. This represents a fundamental shift in design philosophy. Earlier weapons assumed trained operators who understood the technical requirements and could implement them under field conditions. Later weapons assumed that combat degrades technical skill, that stress and exhaustion reduce soldiers to basic functions, that weapons need to work correctly despite operator error or environmental conditions. The dollar bill modification was evidence that the earlier assumption was wrong. The soldiers who fought in the winter of 1944-45 had other concerns. They worried about cold, about ammunition supply, about the tank they could hear but couldn't see, about getting home alive. The bazooka modification was just one more detail in the overwhelming complexity of combat. One more technique to learn and apply, one more tool in the survival toolkit. But that detail mattered. In the moment a tank appeared and a soldier raised his bazooka and fired, in the instant the rocket left the tube and the standoff rig did its job and the shape charge detonated at the optimal distance and the jet burned through steel that should have been impenetrable in that moment, the detail meant everything. It meant the tank stopped. It meant the soldiers lived. It meant going home was still possible. The story of the dollar bill modification isn't really about currency or shape charges or penetration physics. It's about soldiers solving problems, about the gap between official doctrine and battlefield reality, about innovation under the worst possible conditions. It's about making do with what you have, about adapting or dying, about the fundamental resilience and ingenuity that defines infantry warfare. History remembers the big innovations, the wonder weapons, the technological breakthroughs that change warfare. It remembers radar and the atomic bomb and jet engines. It rarely remembers the small adaptations, the field modifications, the improvised solutions that saved individual lives without changing the strategic picture. But those small innovations matter desperately to the men they saved. If you have connections to this history, whether through family service or historical research or preserved artifacts, share them below. These stories deserve to be told and retold. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more untold stories from the war. The dollar bill technique faded from use as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by improved weapons that incorporated the lesson into their design. By the time the Korean War began 5 years later, the M-20's Super Bazooka, with its Trace 5-inch rocket and built-in standoff, had completely replaced the M1A1. Soldiers firing the new weapon never knew about the improvised modification their predecessors had developed, never needed to fold currency and tape it to rockets. But veterans knew. They remembered the winter of 1944, the desperate cold, the German armor, the rockets that wouldn't penetrate until someone thought to add a stick, then a dollar bill, then nothing, because the new weapons worked correctly from the start. They remembered what it felt like to face armor with inadequate weapons, then to suddenly have weapons that worked. They remembered the names of men who died before the modification spread, and the ones who survived because it did. These memories didn't make it into official histories. They appeared in memoirs, in unit newsletters, in reunion conversations, in stories passed down through families. They existed in the unofficial history of the war, the one soldiers told each other, the one that focused on survival and adaptation rather than strategy and operations. The technical principle lived on in every subsequent anti-tank weapon, encoded into design requirements and test protocols, taught in engineering courses and weapons development programs. Modern weapons designers learn about standoff distance in the abstract as a physics problem with optimal solutions. Few know that the requirement was written in the winter mud of Europe by soldiers who needed 6 inches of paper currency to make their weapons kill. The story should matter to anyone interested in how warfare actually functions and how soldiers actually fight in the gap between doctrine and reality. It's a small story in the vast narrative of the war, but it reveals fundamental truths about innovation, adaptation, and the human element in combat. It shows that the best solution isn't always the official one, that soldiers under pressure develop remarkable ingenuity, that sometimes the difference between life and death comes down to a dollar bill and someone clever enough to fold it. The winter of 1944 brought snow and cold and German armor. It also brought this small innovation, this simple modification, this elegant solution to a deadly problem. Somewhere in the chaos of that winter, someone unknown folded a dollar bill, taped it to a rocket, and changed the war for the soldiers around him. His name didn't survive. The technique barely survived. But for the men who used it, who lived because of it, it mattered more than almost anything else. That's the real story of the dollar bill modification. Not the technical details or the penetration physics or the eventual incorporation into official designs, but the human story of soldiers solving the problem in front of them with whatever materials came to hand. It's a story worth remembering, worth preserving, worth sharing with anyone who wants to understand what war is actually like for the people who fight it. If you found this exploration valuable, if it changed how you think about military innovation, if it connected you to this history in a new way, leave a comment sharing your thoughts. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next deep dive into the untold stories of warfare. The modification's legacy extended beyond the immediate tactical improvement it provided. It became part of the informal curriculum that veteran soldiers passed to replacement, part of the survival knowledge that distinguished experienced infantry from green troops fresh from training. This knowledge transfer happened in foxholes and rear areas during lulls between engagements. In the casual conversations where veterans shared what they'd learned about staying alive, the teaching wasn't formalized. No training manual covered it. No officer gave classes on taping dollar bills to rockets. But the information spread through the same networks that transmitted all battlefield wisdom from soldiers who'd survived, to soldiers who wanted to survive. A veteran would watch a replacement prepare his bazooka, notice the absence of standoff, and quietly suggest the modification. Sometimes with explanation, sometimes with just a demonstration. Here's what works. Here's why. Do this. This informal education system existed parallel to official training, filling gaps that formal instruction couldn't address. Training taught doctrine, taught proper procedure, taught what weapons were supposed to do. Veteran knowledge taught what actually worked, what the enemy actually did, what mistakes actually killed you. The dollar bill modification belonged firmly in the second category. The physical act of preparing a modified rocket became ritualized in some units. Soldiers would sit together, preparing ammunition for the next engagement, folding dollar bills with careful precision, applying tape or string with practiced hands. The activity served multiple purposes beyond mere preparation. It gave men something productive to do during tense waiting periods. It reinforced unit cohesion through shared ritual. It provided tangible evidence that they weren't helpless against armor, that they had agency, that they could affect outcomes. Some soldiers became known within their units as particularly skilled at the modification, developing reputations for creating standoff rigs that stayed attached through rough handling and worked reliably under fire. These men found themselves in demand before engagements. Other soldiers seeking their expertise, asking them to prepare rockets or teach the technique. Informal specialization emerging from necessity. Another example of how combat units self-organized around survival and the choice of currency as standoff material, carried symbolic weight beyond its practical utility. Money represented home, represented normalcy, represented the civilian world that soldiers were fighting to return to. Using it as ammunition component created a strange connection between those two worlds, the normal one of commerce and wages and buying things, and the combat one of shaped charges and armor penetration and killing. The juxtaposition wasn't lost on men who spent their dollars buying death for enemy tankers. Different denominations saw experimental use by soldiers, curious whether length variations might improve performance. A $5 bill measured slightly longer, a 20 longer still, but testing revealed that the single dollar's length fell within the optimal range, and the larger denominations offered no advantage worth their increased cost. Practical soldiers stuck with singles, saving their larger bills for the post-combat life they intended to survive to enjoy. The modification worked across different variants of German armor, though with varying results. Against the lighter armor of Panzer IVs and assault guns, even unmodified bazookas could achieve penetration under favorable conditions. The dollar bill rig simply made success more consistent, more reliable, less dependent on luck and angle. Against Panthers and Tigers, the improvement was more dramatic. Armor that had been effectively immune suddenly became vulnerable, at least at close range and from favorable angles. This leveling of the battlefield, however modest, affected German tactical decisions in ways that rippled beyond individual engagements. Tank commanders who'd grown accustomed to relative immunity from American bazookas noticed the change in effectiveness. They grew more cautious, more reluctant, advanced unsupported into urban terrain where infantry might be waiting. This caution slowed German counterattacks, created opportunities for American forces, affected operational outcomes in ways impossible to quantify but nonetheless real. If you've studied the tactical evolution of armor warfare during this period, or if your research has revealed how German forces adapted to improve the American anti-tank capabilities, share your findings below. Understanding both sides of tactical adaptations matters. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more comprehensive explorations of military history. The material science involved in the modification was simultaneously sophisticated and primitive. Sophisticated in that it exploited precisely understood physics governing shape charge jet formation. Primitive in that it used whatever materials soldiers could scavenge: sticks, wire, string, tape, paper currency. This combination characterized much of infantry warfare. Complex technical principles implemented through crude expedients. The copper liner in the bazooka shaped charge had been engineered to exact specifications. The explosive composition, carefully formulated, the fuse mechanism, precisely calibrated, millions of dollars in research and development, industrial facilities, manufacturing to tight tolerances, quality control, ensuring consistency, and then soldiers taped dollar bills to the front because combat had revealed that all that engineering didn't account for how the weapon actually functioned under battlefield conditions. This disconnect between design and reality wasn't unique to the bazooka. Nearly every weapon system revealed similar gaps when subjected to combat use. The elegant solutions of engineering laboratories encountered the messy chaos of warfare and required adaptation. The soldiers making those adaptations rarely had engineering degrees or technical training. They had desperation, creativity, and a powerful incentive to make things work. The bazooka itself represented a particular American approach to weapons design, relatively simple, relatively cheap, designed for mass production and used by soldiers with modest training. This philosophy accepted certain limitations in exchange for getting effective weapons to troops quickly and in quantity. The shape charge principle provided anti-armor capability without requiring the complex mechanisms of artillery or the massive bulk of anti-tank guns. But that simplicity came with trade. The lightweight tube and simple firing mechanism meant the rocket had relatively low velocity, limiting range and accuracy. The shape-charged warhead worked brilliantly under optimal conditions, but suffered when those conditions weren't met. The weapon was good enough for most purposes, but not excellent at any particular task. It was, in many ways, a typically American solution, practical, scalable, leaving room for soldiers to adapt as needed. The Germans had developed their own shape-charged weapons following similar principles. The Panzerfaust series, the Panzer Schreckkopie, from captured bazookas, various rifle grenades, and magnetic charges. Each nation's approach reflected their military culture and industrial capabilities. German weapons tended toward over-engineering, complex and effective, but difficult to manufacture in quantity. American weapons favored simplicity in mass production, accepting modest performance in exchange for availability. The shape charge principle itself represented one of those rare technological developments that fundamentally changed warfare. Before shape charges, infantry had no effective means of destroying tanks. The only solutions involved large caliber guns, massive and immobile, or artillery, inaccurate and slow. Shape charges made anti-armor capability portable, gave individual soldiers the means to destroy vehicles that cost thousands of times what their weapons cost. This democratization of lethality shifted tactical dynamics. Tanks could no longer operate with impunity near infantry. Urban terrain became more dangerous. The balance between armor and anti-armor forces moved toward equilibrium, and like most technological shifts, it happened gradually, with both sides adapting and counter-adapting, each innovation prompting responses that required further innovation. The dollar bill modification fit into this cycle. German armor had become effective enough that American bazookas struggled to penetrate. Soldiers adapted, improving their weapons performance. German forces responded with tactical changes and armor modifications. The cycle continued, driven by the fundamental pressure of combat where ineffective weapons meant death and effective ones meant survival. If your family's military service included this period, or if you've collected veteran accounts that describe the evolution of anti-tank tactics, share them in the comments. These first-hand perspectives are invaluable. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more detailed explorations of military technology and tactics. The winter campaigns where the dollar bill modifications saw widest use represented a particular moment in the wars of German forces, though weakened and pushed back, remained dangerous and well-equipped with armor. American forces had achieved numerical and logistical superiority, but still faced determined resistance. The fighting combined desperate German defensive efforts with methodical American advances, creating conditions where infantry anti-tank weapons mattered enormously. Urban combat amplified the modification's importance. In cities and towns, engagement ranges compressed, tanks couldn't maneuver freely, couldn't use their range and firepower advantages, had to navigate streets and rubble where infantry could wait in ambush. These conditions favored short-range anti-tank weapons, made the bazooka relevant despite its limitations. And in those close-quarters engagements, the difference between a rocket that penetrated and one that didn't often determined who survived. The rubble of European cities provided both cover for American infantry and vulnerability for German armor. Tank commanders faced impossible choices: advance and risk ambush, retreat and yield ground, wait for infantry support that might not arrive. American bazooka teams learned to exploit these dilemmas, positioning themselves where tanks had to pass, waiting for side and rear shots where armor was thinnest, coordinating attacks so tanks faced threats from multiple directions. The dollar bill modification made these ambush tactics more viable. Soldiers who might have hesitated to engage armor, knowing their weapons often failed, grew more willing to take the shot when they trusted their equipment. This increased willingness to engage created a psychological effect beyond the purely tactical. German tank commanders knew American infantry had bazookas, but knowing that the bazookas now worked consistently changed threat calculations. Weather conditions during the winter of 1944-45 added another layer of complexity. Extreme cold affected everything from weapon function to human performance. The bazooka's electrical firing system sometimes failed in freezing conditions. The rocket motors burned less efficiently. Human fingers grew numb, making fine motor tasks difficult. And yet soldiers still had to prepare their modified rockets, still had to tape dollar bills with cold, clumsy hands, still had to make the weapons work despite everything. The modification's simplicity became an advantage in these conditions. Unlike complex mechanical improvements that might fail in cold or require maintenance, the dollar bill rig was nearly idiot-proof. Tape it on, fire. The standoff worked regardless of temperature, required no adjustment, couldn't freeze or malfunction. In an environment where everything else seemed designed to fail, this reliability mattered enormously. Supply considerations affected how widely the modification could be implemented. Dollar bills were personal property, and while most soldiers had some currency, using it for weapons modification represented a real cost. Some units addressed this by providing currency from unit funds or unofficial sources. Others left it to individual initiative, accepting that some soldiers would modify their rockets and others wouldn't based on personal resource availability. The tape or string used for attachment posed its own supply challenges. Adhesive tape wasn't standard issue for infantry, and what tape existed got used for dozens of purposes from first aid to equipment repair. String was more available but less reliable, requiring careful tying to ensure the standoff stayed attached. Soldiers scrounged both materials wherever they could find them, added them to the informal list of critical supplies that formal logistics didn't adequately provide. This constant scrounging for materials, for the small items that made the difference between weapons working and weapons failing, characterized infantry experience. Official supply channels provided food, ammunition, fuel, the major categories of logistics. But combat required thousands of small items: wire, tape, string, spare parts, improvised tools that soldiers had to acquire through unofficial means. The dollar bill modification existed in this gray zone of unofficial but necessary adaptations, not forbidden but not approved, not supplied but not prevented, acknowledged by commanders who chose to look the other way because the modification worked and their men needed every advantage they could get. This pragmatic tolerance defined how many combat innovations spread through deliberate official blindness that allowed soldiers to do what needed doing. If you've encountered other examples of this kind of pragmatic tolerance in military history, or if your research has revealed how commanders balance regulations with combat effectiveness, share your insights below. These organizational dynamics shaped how innovation spread. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more examinations of military culture and adaptation. The soldiers who employed the modification rarely thought about its historical significance. They thought about the tank approaching their position, about whether their rocket would penetrate, about surviving the next hour. The broader implications, the lessons for weapons design, the example of battlefield innovation, all of that came later, imposed by historians and analysts trying to extract meaning from chaos. But in the moment, the modification was purely practical. A problem existed. Someone developed a solution. The solution spread because it worked. Men who used it survived more often than men who didn't. That was all the meaning that mattered in combat. All the justification that was needed, the elaborate analysis, the physics explanations, the historical significance, all of that was retrospective, imposed after the fact by people not facing German armor. This disconnect between participant and observer perspectives characterizes much of military history. Soldiers experienced events as immediate, visceral, focused on survival. Historians examined those same events as data points, as examples of broader trends, as lessons to be learned. Neither perspective was wrong, but they existed in different contexts, served different purposes, answered different questions. The soldier taping a dollar bill to his bazooka rocket wasn't thinking about shape charge physics or standoff optimization. He was thinking that this technique reportedly worked, that his squad leader had recommended it, that he wanted every advantage he could get because tanks terrified him and he desperately wanted to go home. The modification was personal insurance, a talisman of effectiveness, a ritual of preparation as much as a technical improvement. The psychological comfort of rituals shouldn't be discounted in assessing combat effectiveness. Soldiers facing overwhelming stress needed mechanisms for maintaining control, for feeling that they had agency, for believing they could affect outcomes. The careful preparation of modified rockets served this psychological need as much as it served the technical need for improved penetration. Men who felt they'd done everything possible to prepare fought more effectively than men who felt helpless. Unit cohesion benefited from shared knowledge of effective techniques. When a veteran showed a replacement how to prepare modified rockets, he wasn't just transferring technical information, he was welcoming the new soldier into the informal community of combat veterans, acknowledging him as someone worth investing time in, someone who might survive to become a veteran himself. These small rituals of knowledge transfer reinforced bonds that kept units functional under stress. The modifications spread through units followed patterns typical of information transmission in military organizations. A technique would appear first among veterans, the soldiers most attuned to what worked and most willing to experiment. They would share it with close comrades, with men they trusted. As the technique proved itself, it would spread more widely, reaching throughout the unit, eventually jumping to adjacent units through the constant communication between frontline soldiers. Officers generally learned about such modifications after they'd already spread through enlisted ranks. This wasn't necessarily a failure of leadership. It reflected the reality that soldiers closest to combat often identified problems and developed solutions faster than formal command structures could respond. Smart officers recognized this, leveraged it, encouraged the upward flow of tactical innovation while maintaining the downward flow of strategic direction. The dollar bill modification represented this kind of bottom-up innovation perfectly. No officer ordered it. No technical bulletin authorized it. It emerged from the collective problem-solving of infantry facing armor, spread through informal networks, achieved effectiveness through organic adoption rather than formal implementation, and officers who recognized its value simply got out of the way and let it happen. If you've studied military innovation and how effective practices spread through armed forces, or if you have access to command perspectives on field modifications, share that information below. Understanding these processes helps explain how militaries actually adapt. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more deep explorations of military organizations and culture. The question of attribution, who actually invented the technique, is ultimately unanswerable and perhaps unimportant. Likely multiple soldiers in different units developed similar solutions independently, following the same logic, exploiting the same physics, arriving at the same conclusion about standoff requirements. The simultaneous invention of solutions to common problems happens constantly in combat. Driven by shared circumstances and universal human ingenuity, what mattered wasn't who thought of it first, but that the solution spread, that soldiers shared the knowledge, that units adopted the practice, that the modification saved lives. The anonymous soldier who first folded a dollar bill deserves credit, not for unique genius, but for practical problem solving under pressure. And the hundreds or thousands of soldiers who adopted and adapted the technique deserve equal credit for recognizing effective solutions and implementing them. This collective, distributed nature of innovation is often invisible in historical accounts that focus on individual inventors and single moments of discovery. Real innovation, especially in combat, works differently. It emerges from many minds working on the same problem, develops through iteration and testing, spreads through organic networks, succeeds through adoption rather than invention. The dollar bill modification exemplifies this process. The modification also demonstrates how combat drives technological evolution faster than peacetime development ever could. The pressure of survival, the immediate feedback of success or failure, the deadly consequences of ineffective weapons, these factors create an innovation environment that laboratories cannot replicate. Combat testing is brutal but definitive. If it works, soldiers use it. If it doesn't, they abandon it. The marketplace of ideas operated at maximum efficiency when the currency was human lives. This observation isn't meant to glorify combat or suggest that war is necessary for innovation. It's simply acknowledgement that extreme pressure produces rapid adaptation, and few pressures exceed that of combat. The challenge for militaries has always been finding ways to capture that innovative energy, that creative problem solving, that rapid iteration without requiring actual warfare to drive it. The development of better testing protocols, more realistic training, closer integration between developers and users, all of these represent attempts to simulate combat pressure without combat casualties. The dollar bill modification suggested that these attempts often fall short, that combat reveals problems that peacetime never anticipates, that soldiers under fire develop solutions that engineers and laboratories never consider. Modern military development emphasizes rapid prototyping, field testing, iterative design, user feedback loops, all attempts to close the gap between laboratory and battlefield, to identify and solve problems before soldiers die because of them. These methods represent lessons learned from countless examples like the dollar bill modification, where official development failed to account for real-world conditions and soldiers had to fix the problems themselves. The Bazookas' evolution from M1 to M1, A1 to M9, A1 to M20 reflected this iterative process, each generation incorporating lessons from the previous one, each improvement addressing problems identified through combat use. The addition of built-in standoff in later models was one of dozens of refinements that made subsequent weapons more effective, more reliable, more suitable for combat employment. But even with all those improvements, even with standoff built-in and penetration improved and accuracy enhanced, later bazookas still required field adaptations, still revealed problems in combat that hadn't appeared in testing, still benefited from soldier ingenuity applied to unexpected challenges. The cycle never ended. It couldn't end. Combat was too complex, too chaotic, too variable for any weapon to work perfectly without adaptation. If your understanding of weapons development includes examples of how combat feedback shaped design, or if you've accessed primary sources describing this iterative process, share them in the comments. These development stories matter for understanding military technology. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more detailed examinations of how weapons actually evolve through use. The story of the dollar bill modification fades from documentation as 1945 progressed and the war in Europe entered its final phase. References appear less frequently in unit histories, Veteran accounts mention it less often. The technique recedes from the historical record as it became superseded by improved weapons in changing tactical circumstances. This fading mirrors the experience of countless small innovations that mattered intensely for a period then disappeared as conditions changed. But the principles survived. The recognition that standoff distance mattered for shape charge effectiveness became permanent knowledge, incorporated into weapons design, taught in military schools, understood by everyone who worked with anti-armor weapons. The specific implementation dollar bills taped to rockets was temporary. The lesson it taught was eternal. This pattern of temporary implementation, teaching permanent lessons, characterizes much of military innovation. Specific techniques come and go, adapted to particular circumstances, abandoned when those circumstances change. But the underlying principles persist, shaping how future problems are approached, informing how future solutions are developed. The dollar bill modification was forgotten. The importance of standoff distance was not. Veterans who used the modification rarely talked about it after the war. It was too small a detail in the vast experience of combat, too minor compared to the larger stories of survival and loss, too technical for civilians to understand or care about. When they told war stories, they talked about the men they'd served with, the battles they'd fought, the places they'd been. The dollar bill modification, if mentioned at all, was a footnote, a curious detail, not the heart of any narrative. But occasionally, when veterans gathered and conversation turned technical, when they discussed weapons and tactics and what had actually worked, the modification would come up. Someone would mention it, and others would nod, remembering. They'd compare notes on different implementations, debate whether sticks or dollar bills worked better, reminisce about the satisfaction of watching a modified rocket punch through armor that had seemed impenetrable. These conversations kept the memory alive in veteran communities even as it faded from broader historical consciousness. The physical artifacts, rockets with dollar bills still attached, preserved as souvenirs, or donated to museums, became tangible links to this history. Someone handling such an artifact could see exactly how the modification worked, could understand the simplicity of the solution, could appreciate the ingenuity of soldiers who made it work. These objects told stories that written accounts struggled to convey, made the past physically present in ways that words alone could not. Museums displaying such artifacts faced interesting interpretive challenges. How to explain the technical principle without drowning visitors in physics? How to convey the desperation that drove innovation without sensationalizing combat? How to honor soldier ingenuity while acknowledging that the modification wouldn't have been necessary if the weapon had been designed correctly in the first place? These questions had no perfect answers, only compromises that tried to balance multiple valid perspectives. The modification's place in military history remains ambiguous, and perhaps appropriately so. It wasn't significant enough to merit chapters in major histories of the war. It didn't change strategic outcomes or affect major battles. But it mattered profoundly to the soldiers who used it, who survived because of it, who killed enemy armor that might otherwise have killed them. How do we weigh individual significance against strategic insignificance? How do we value innovations that saved dozens or hundreds of lives but didn't change the war's outcome? These questions don't have objective answers. They depend on perspective, on values, on what we think history should remember, and why. From one angle, the dollar bill modification is trivial, unworthy of attention in the vast narrative of global conflict. From another, it's fundamental, representative of how war actually works and how soldiers actually fight. Both views are valid. Both reveal something true. If this exploration has given you new perspective on military history, or if you found value in examining small innovations rather than grand strategies, share your thoughts below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more stories that examine war from ground level, from the perspective of soldiers solving immediate problems with whatever tools came to hand.